March 1943. The middle of the North Atlantic, 400 miles from anything. A German U-boat sits at 90 meters, engines dead slow. Every man aboard breathing as quietly as a human being can breathe. Above them, a Destroyer Escort is working a sonar search pattern, and the crew below can hear it. That's the thing nobody explains properly about submarine warfare. You don't see the ship hunting you. You hear it, through the hull, as a ping that arrives and fades, and for 2 years of this war, that ping told you everything you needed to know to survive. You could count the intervals between pings and estimate range. You could listen for the pitch to rise as the propellers closed in, and you knew that the instant the pinging stopped, the ship had lost you underneath its own hull, in the sonar's blind spot, and that was your moment. That was when you turned hard and ran, because for 3 seconds, maybe 4, nobody topside could see you at all. Crews trained on this. Commanders drilled their helmsmen on it the way a boxer drills a slip. It wasn't luck, it was a read, and a good captain could read it every time. On this particular night, the pinging stops. The crew waits for the turn window. Nothing happens. No engines revving away, no charges rolling off the stern. Just silence, for a beat too long. Then something enters the water above them, and it isn't a depth charge, because a depth charge you can hear sinking, that low mechanical clunk of a canister falling through the sea. This makes almost no sound at all. 11 seconds later, the sea around them tears open, and men who had done this 100 times, who knew depth charges, who could shrug off a near miss and keep working, are looking at each other, because whatever just happened, it didn't play by the rules they'd learned to survive by. That weapon had a name. The ship carrying it had a name too, and by 1943, that name was starting to circulate through U-boat wardrooms with a kind of dread that the older destroyers had never earned. The Destroyer Escort. If you're new here, we dig up the forgotten hardware and the field-tested tricks that actually decided who lived through this war. The stuff that never made it into the documentaries. Stick around, because the reason this ship broke the rules is a genuinely strange piece of engineering, and the tactic built around it is one of the coldest ideas of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what a depth charge attack actually looked like from both ends. Because for the first 3 years of the war, both sides had memorized the choreography, and it really was a kind of choreography. Practiced, repeated, almost formal, the way two boxers who fought before settle into a rhythm they both already know. A destroyer gets a sonar contact. It closes in, pinging the whole way, and the U-boat commander below is listening to that ping like a countdown clock. Here's the part that made the whole system survivable for submarines. Sonar in this era is a single beam, and it can only look forward. Once the attacking ship gets close enough, the submarine passes directly underneath the hull, and the sonar operator loses it completely. There's a dead zone right beneath any surface ship, and it can last anywhere from 10 to 30 seconds depending on depth and speed. Any submariner who lived past his first patrol knew that gap the way a driver knows a blind spot in traffic. You didn't think about it, you just used it. Every submarine captain in this war knew that dead zone existed, and every one of them used it. The moment the pinging stopped, meaning the moment the destroyer lost contact, was the moment to turn the boat hard and change depth, because the destroyer was now guessing. It would run its pattern, roll depth charges off the stern set to detonate at an estimated depth, and by the time those charges went off, sometimes 20 or 30 seconds after the moment of maximum danger, the submarine could already be 400 meters away in a completely different direction, at a different depth entirely. This is why depth charge attacks, for all the noise and all the newsreel footage, had a mediocre kill rate for most of the war. The weapon exploded exactly where the enemy used to be. Whole convoy escort logs from 1941 and early 1942 are full of attacks logged as probable damage or contact lost, presumed evaded. The ocean was enormous, the guesswork was real, and a patient U-boat commander could survive a lot of guessing. Some German crews got so confident in the routine that veteran commanders described depth charging almost the way a man describes bad weather. Unpleasant, occasionally dangerous, but ultimately something you had a system for. Now, the Allies knew this. Everybody with a slide rule and an anti-submarine warfare posting knew this. The dead zone was the whole problem, and fixing it meant solving two things at once. You needed a weapon that didn't need the ship to pass directly over the target, and you needed a fuse that only went off on contact, so the enemy couldn't hear an explosion and think he'd survived when actually he was still being tracked. The British got there first with something called Hedgehog, a spigot mortar that threw a pattern of 24 small projectiles forward, ahead of the ship, while the sonar operator still had the target locked. It looked almost comical on deck, this cluster of thin spigots, angled up like some kind of iron flower bed, and the first crews to see one weren't sure it would work at all. No dead zone. The ship never had to lose contact to attack, and because each projectile only detonated on physical contact with a hull, silence didn't mean safety anymore. Silence just meant you missed. That distinction sounds small. It rewired the entire psychology of the hunt. Early British trials had been rocky, plenty of duds, plenty of officers who thought the whole contraption was a gimmick that would get quietly shelved within a year. It wasn't. The Americans adopted it, refined the fuses, tightened the spread pattern, and started welding it onto a new class of ship built specifically to hunt submarines in bulk. That ship was the Destroyer Escort, and it's worth pausing on how strange this vessel actually was, because it wasn't built to be impressive. It was built to be everywhere. A fleet destroyer was a fast, expensive, multi-role warship, and America never had enough of them to cover every convoy crossing the Atlantic. The Destroyer Escort was the opposite philosophy entirely. Slower, cheaper, smaller crew, and stripped of most of the surface warfare gear a real destroyer carried. Because a destroyer escort was never meant to fight another ship. Its entire reason for existing was to sit beside a convoy of merchant vessels for 2 weeks at a stretch and listen. Some captains who transferred over from fleet destroyers reportedly considered it a demotion at first. A slow, ugly little vessel with none of the glamour, right up until they realized what it was actually built to do. There was no prestige posting attached to a destroyer escort command, no newspaper photographers waiting on the dock, just weeks of gray ocean and a sonar operator's headset. Shipyards on the American coast turned these things out in a way that genuinely startled German naval planners. Over 500 were laid down before the program wound down. And that number matters, because it meant a convoy in 1943 wasn't escorted by 1 or 2 overworked destroyers doing their best. It was ringed by a screen of these things, cheap enough to mass produce, dull enough that nobody wrote songs about them, and every single one carrying a weapon that erased the dead zone. A U-boat commander could no longer count the number of hunters he was up against just by counting ships on the horizon, because these things kept multiplying faster than anyone on the German side had accounted for in their planning. Naval intelligence reports from Berlin, as early as mid-1943, show a grudging recalculation of just how many hulls the Americans could put in the water in a single year, and the number kept being wrong in the same direction, always higher than expected. If you're finding this rabbit hole as satisfying as we do, there's a lot more of it. Hit subscribe, because we go looking for exactly this kind of overlooked engineering every week, the stuff that quietly decided a battle while getting none of the credit. Hedgehog alone was a real problem for U-boat crews, but it wasn't the thing that actually built the reputation this video is named after. The truly dark part came from what happened when 2 destroyer escorts worked to contact together in a tactic the US Navy called the creeping attack. Here's the setup. One ship, call it the Director, holds sonar contact on the submarine from a distance, far enough back that its own propeller noise doesn't interfere with the ping, and it talks the second ship into position by radio. That second ship, the attacker, closes in dead slow, often at only a few knots, and critically, it does not ping at all. It goes in blind, steered entirely by voice instructions relayed from the director ship, which is tracking the submarine's exact position the whole time. From the bridge of the attacker, there's nothing to see and nothing to hear from the target at all. Just a stream of bearings coming over the radio from a ship that isn't even in visual range half the time. The attacking crew is, in a very real sense, flying blind on purpose, trusting a voice on a headset more than their own instruments. Sit with what that means for the crew underneath. In an ordinary attack, you could hear the enemy coming. You had a ping, a rising pitch, an engine note that told you when the danger was closing and roughly how fast. In a creeping attack, the ship that's actually going to kill you is silent, no ping to count, no engine surge you can time your turn against. The only sound is a second, distant ship pinging away somewhere off your beam, sounding for all the world like it's the one hunting you, while the real threat idles up from a completely different direction with its screws barely turning. Everything a U-boat crew had ever trained their ears to listen for was, in this scenario, actively lying to them. Picture it from inside that hull. Men standing at their stations, tracking a familiar sound they've heard 100 times, feeling almost confident because the pattern looks manageable, while the actual danger is somewhere else entirely, closing in at walking pace with its own crew barely breathing. Survivors from these engagements, in post-war interviews and in the handful of surviving boat logs pulled from wrecks, describe a specific kind of dread that depth charging never produced, because depth charging was violent, but at least it was legible. You knew the shape of the danger. The creeping attack removed the one tool every U-boat commander had relied on since 1939, which was the ability to read the enemy's intentions through sound alone. You were being hunted by something that had gone quiet on purpose, and quiet, in that war, had always meant safety before it started meaning the opposite. Some accounts describe crews growing more afraid of silence than of the pinging itself by late 1943, which is about as complete a psychological inversion as this kind of warfare ever produced. Training manuals on the German side reportedly tried to address it directly, warning crews not to assume that a lull in sonar activity meant the attack had been broken off, but a manual can only do so much against months of instinct built up the opposite way. The tactic also depended on discipline that's easy to underrate. The two destroyer escorts running a creeping attack had to trust each other completely, because the attacking ship was, for the length of the run, essentially deaf and blind to the actual target. If the directorship's plot was off by even a little, if the bearing relayed over the radio drifted from the real position, the whole attack could roll charges into empty water while the submarine slipped free underneath them both. Crews drilled this exact handoff for weeks before it was trusted in combat, timing the radio calls, refining how often a bearing update needed to come through to keep the geometry honest. It wasn't a clever idea somebody had once and executed perfectly on the first try. It was rehearsed until the coordination became close to automatic, which is usually how the tactics that actually work in this war ended up looking simple from the outside. There was a training cost to all of this that rarely gets mentioned, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Crews assigned to these hunter-killer groups spent weeks running dry attacks against friendly submarines that volunteered for the job. Boats whose only task was to sit quietly in a training area off the American coast and let inexperienced sonar teams practice losing them and finding them again. It was tedious, unglamorous work, hour after hour of a training officer grading how cleanly a directorship handed a bearing to an attacker, and sailors who went through it have described it as more mentally exhausting than actual combat, because in combat, at least something eventually happened. In training, the tedium was the entire exercise, over and over, until the handoff stopped requiring conscious thought at all. The results showed up fast. Through 1943, in what naval historians sometimes call Black May for the sheer scale of German losses that single month, hunter-killer groups built around destroyer escorts, and Hedgehog started posting kill numbers that the old depth charge screens never managed. Convoy routing improvements and code breaking obviously did enormous work here too. This wasn't one weapon winning an ocean, but crews on both sides of the fight came away with the same read on what had changed at the sharp end of an actual attack. The Americans had taken away the two things a submerged submarine used to survive: the blind spot underneath the attacking ship and the audible countdown before the charges landed. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who ran the U-boat arm for most of the war and had built his entire operational doctrine around Wolfpack tactics and evasion under sonar, was forced to pull boats out of the North Atlantic that same month because losses had simply become unsustainable, a retreat that would have been unthinkable to him 2 years earlier. It's worth being honest about the limits of this, because the story doesn't stay one-sided, and that's actually the more interesting part. German engineers weren't sitting still while their boats got hunted more efficiently. Late in the war, they fielded acoustic homing torpedoes that chased a ship's own propeller noise, forcing destroyer escorts to start towing noise-making decoys behind them just to survive their own attack runs. A strange bit of symmetry, where the hunters had to start worrying about being hunted back by their own targets. And the Schnorkel, That breathing tube that let a U-boat run its diesels while still submerged gave crews back some of the speed and endurance they'd lost, letting them slip away from a creeping attack before the second ship ever got into position. The hunt kept evolving in both directions until the war ended it. Nobody involved would tell you Hedgehog and the creeping attack were some unbeatable silver bullet. What they'll tell you is that for a stretch of 1943, that mattered enormously. Those two things together took the one psychological advantage submarine crews had always counted on and simply removed it. There's also a quieter postscript to all this that rarely makes it into the popular telling, and it changes how you should think about the whole program. A lot of Destroyer Escort crews spent the entire war never firing Hedgehog at a confirmed kill, running patrol after patrol on convoys that made it across without incident, which was in a sense the whole point. A submarine that stayed away from a convoy because the escort screen looked too dense to risk never shows up in a kill count anywhere, and there's no way to properly credit a ship for an attack that never happened because the enemy decided against it. Some historians have argued the deterrent effect of these hunter-killer groups mattered as much as the actual sinkings, simply because German patrol logs from the period show growing caution around any convoy escorted by a dense enough screen, caution that cost the U-boat campaign momentum without a single depth charge being dropped. And that's really the through line of this whole story, more than any single kill count. For the first half of the Battle of the Atlantic, a U-boat crew's survival depended on being able to read their hunters, on sound discipline running in both directions. You listened to them, they listened for you, and the side that flinched first usually lost. The Destroyer Escort, this unglamorous, mass-produced, faintly boring-looking ship that nobody put on a recruiting poster, broke that exchange on purpose. It attacked without pinging. It fired without losing contact. It made silence into the dangerous option instead of the safe one, and by the time German crews figured out exactly what that meant, an awful lot of boats had already stopped reporting in. Entire patrols simply went quiet on the radio and never resumed contact with headquarters in Lorient. And for months, nobody back home could say with certainty what had happened to them. There's a particular kind of ship that never gets a documentary of its own, because it wasn't fast, it wasn't beautiful, and it never once fought another warship in a fair fight. It just showed up by the hundreds, went quiet at exactly the wrong moment for whoever was underneath it, and went home again. That's the whole story of the Destroyer Escort, and it's probably why almost nobody outside a handful of naval historians has ever heard of the tactic that made it so feared. If you want more of this, more of the equipment that never got the movie treatment but genuinely decided how the fighting went, subscribe and stick around, because we've got a lot more of these buried in the archives. And now, we want to hear your take. Was the creeping attack the smartest piece of psychological warfare the US Navy ran in the entire war, or does it get too much credit next to the codebreakers and the long-range aircraft that were closing the mid-Atlantic gap at the same time? Tell us in the comments. We read every one of them.